Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories and inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you highly organised and love working in a fast-paced environment? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an executive legal assistant to support a national leader on a 12-month fixed-term contract based in Melbourne, Victoria. This will include coordinating and supporting the leader with high-level administrative assistance, coordinating documents with strong attention to detail, building and managing relationships with key internal and external stakeholders, and providing excellent client service. To apply for that role, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your favourite weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, we're getting towards the end of our state-by-state post-election wrap-up. We're going to do two states in the one hit today. We're going to look at Tasmania and we're going to look at South Australia. We're going to speak to Jack Milroy, who you will have heard on the show before, and they're going to talk to us about how things went in Tasmania. Tough campaign for the guys down in the Apple Isle. And we'll also be speaking to the Labor Party State Secretary in South Australia, Aemon Bourke, to talk us through the great result they had on election night when they finally won the seat of Boothby and almost jagged the seat of Sturt, and have a bit more of a deep dive into the broader results across Metro Adelaide. So check out today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast. And when you're done listening to today's episode, leave us a review on either podcast, on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all of the updates, follow Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And now we're moving to a state that is near and dear to my heart, a place I lived there for 5 years, South Australia, to break down the post-election results in the great state of South Australia. And joining me on the line from Adelaide is the South Australian Labor State Secretary, Aemon Bourke. Aemon, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Stephen, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Last time I saw you was obviously on election night in the chaos that was, and this stupid idea that we had of doing a live telecast. And I think you were I don't know where you were actually, but I guess you were in the results room, and we were basically just trying to get what is going on in Boothby, because we were all hoping that Boothby would come home, and it did in the end. Tell us a bit about your election night. How did it pan out for you?
Well, like most sort of party office tally rooms, it's a mixture of complete chaos, probably people almost vomiting in the corner out of nervousness, and everything in between. And, it's always quiet for the first sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, especially in South Australia where, our booths don't close. We start to get the trickle of the eastern states, and where, results are coming in, but where are Boothby's? And of course, everyone forgets, ourselves included, that, we're still half an hour behind. Complete sort of chaos. And the initial sort of run in Boothby, when results started to come through at about 7:30 our time, 8 o'clock Eastern, they looked very good. The initial run, I think the first proper booth in that was sort of important to us was up in Blackwood, which is, for those familiar, is sort of in the inner hills of Adelaide. And it's an area where Louise Miller-Frost, the Labor candidate, had worked hard. But what was most pleasing is we knew Nadia Clancy, the previous candidate, had worked Blackwood really hard the election before and got a solid result there. So to have a solid result on top of a solid result, that sort of first initial big booth was a very, very good sign. And then it was just holding firm and waiting for results to come sort of through the middle, which you'd call more the red part of Boothby is obviously down the centre, and for those familiar, it's the bluer parts are on the beach and on the edge of the hills. So we had to sort of sit tight and, as the blue areas came through, it looked good, but we just had to sit tight for the areas in the spine, and some of those results sort of started to come through. And as was probably the case nationwide, those areas that were traditionally more red, the swings weren't quite as strong as in general in those sort of blue or more sort of green in the not political sense, but green in the sort of climate sort of sense.
Well, we're going to deep dive about Boothby in a moment, but before we do that, just for our listeners, let's give them a bit of an overview of the statewide results in South Australia. The two-party preferred at this moment, I know the count hasn't actually finished, but it's a 3.4% swing to Labor on the two-party preferred basis. That's a 54.1% 2PP for Labor, 45.9% to the Coalition. And then on a primary count, the Coalition are on, they had a 5.2% swing against them on their primary, and obviously lost a seat, reducing to 3. Labor had a 1% swing against its primary, but obviously picked up that seat in Boothby, which we'll talk about in a moment. The Greens had a 3% swing to them and took their primary to 12 and a bit. 4% swing to One Nation to bring it up to 4.8. An actual swing against United Palmer to drag their vote down to about 3.9, and then others was also a swing against others of 0.5%, which took them to 8.6. Broadly speaking, across the state, what do you draw from that set of numbers, and also just keeping in mind the fact that you've literally just come off a hard-fought South Australian state election campaign? Looking at those figures there, I mean, does that align similar to the state result, or is there some discrepancies?
So obviously, in a general sense, it roughly aligns. I think one of our concerns coming out of the state election and backing straight into a third was what was sort of the jet stream out of the state election. And as we all know, pandemic politics had meant state politics had come to the forefront of people's minds more so than feds. So it was almost an inverse of tradition, and it was a bit of an unknown as to what the jet stream would be. And I think I haven't probably got a complete answer in my mind yet. But needless to say, I think there was significant momentum to Labor at a state level for various reasons. And in a rough sense, we were able through the federal campaign to carry that momentum on in a pretty general sense across the state. And that's reflected in overall in the sort of statewide two-party preferred. We were getting decent traction in areas that we otherwise wouldn't. Sturt, which is another eastern suburbs blue ribbon seat, came strongly our way. Boothby, which we'll obviously deep dive into, had been campaigned out. There wasn't a voter who hadn't been campaigned to in the last 15 years. Coming out of a state election, we weren't quite sure where voters' minds were going to be at. It could have been easily, we've just risked it all with Malinowskis. We're going to hedge our bets. That was a pretty, there was some rational thought around that. But thankfully, I think the statewide momentum out of state carried roughly through federally in a roundabout way. There was a few independents floating around out in particularly in Grey, which is sort of a really large part of South Australia, takes in the Spencer Gulf and everywhere else. And that meant, the Liberals were sort of tied up defending their home bases. And we were able to sort of keep rolling on in Metro Adelaide.
In previous federal election campaigns in South Australia, certainly when I lived there, there was both an offensive and a defensive setting for the Labor campaign. I mean, once Labor won Adelaide and Hindmarsh, there was always a need to defend and seriously defend those seats. Plus, obviously, looking at picking up a seat like Boothby, as you mentioned before, and as we talked ad nauseum on the night, it's a seat that Labor's prized for a long, long time. Going into this campaign, was there any kind of defensive setting, or did you feel confident about the turf that Labor held and just let those local campaigns do their thing, and it was basically putting all resources into trying to secure Boothby?
Yeah, absolutely the latter. It was 100% all in on Boothby, and then that was the first order. Boothby was the second order, and Boothby was the third order, and then maybe then the fourth order priority was, Sturt Senate-wide campaign. But we were confident with our incumbents, and I think one thing that served us well straight out of the state election is there was a fair statewide momentum to us, and we got really close on a couple of unexpected seats. But the seats that we needed to win, which are our 5 key targets, we never took our eye off them in the state election. So I was just applying that same logic, but instead of doing it to 5 seats, what Boothby needed and wanted, in a relative sense, it got, because I used to sort of joke we'd been chasing the mirage in the desert in Boothby, so the better part of since 2007. And we were finally there. We weren't going to let this mirage disappear on us this time. So, absolutely whatever it took. And to be honest, that will cause some internal criticism around, we did get very close in Sturt, and there's going to be people who ask legitimate what-if questions. But I would have rather, this is probably harsh, but I'd rather win Boothby by 5,000 votes than lose it by 1. So that was the simple rationale.
It's funny, it's funny you say you get criticism, because my feeling has always been externally since I've moved back to Melbourne from South Australia, and there's something that I'd always admired about the South Australian campaign was the concentration that the campaign has always put on the seats that you need to win, to either hold government or win back government. A frustration that I had as a former party official was when, the secretary would come in and, suggest, we're going to reallocate resources to other seats because of more data or information has been coming in, as if you can just pick up, 2,000 volunteers and just dump them into another seat, like on a monopoly board or something. It should give them the shit. But there's always been a good focus from you guys about, well, no, this is the seat we're going to go after, and we're going to execute this all the way up until election day. Let's talk about Boothby. What do you think going into this campaign? What did you need to do to turn this mirage into a reality?
A lot of the groundwork had sort of the solid foundation had legitimately been laid by candidates previous. Very much so Nadia Clancy just beforehand, who then became a state MP in the state election just previous. So Nadia had laid a lot of groundwork, as had other candidates. So, there wasn't, as I said before, a target voter who hadn't been campaigned to in the last 10 years. So it wasn't any miracle working. It wasn't any strategic genius. It was just hard work. And, that's what most marginal seats come down to. It's campaigning's not hard. Campaigning's just hard work. And Louise Miller-Frost is slightly different in a sense of she's not an institutionalised Labor person in the sense of, she hadn't been a Labor member that long. She hadn't been come up through the system, so to speak, which sometimes we're criticised for. She had a pretty impressive background working for non-profits. So there was an absolute quality candidate. And that's not taken away. That's not to suggest previous candidates weren't quality, but she was slightly different. And that presented a risk because she was slightly green to campaigning. But with that, I think Louise was open to every and all suggestions. And when a suggestion was made to her, she did it, she learnt from it and made it work. So, it was just the hard grind. And it became a campaign in 2 bits for Louise and the Boothby campaign. And there's a few names I should probably mention, none more so than Tom Mooney, who was a campaign manager, whilst also volunteering as a campaign manager, but also working as Penny Wong's chief of staff. So he had 2 pretty significant roles taking place simultaneously. But a campaign in almost 2 bits. The pre-Christmas part, which was laying the foundation, name recognition. And then to Louise's and the campaign's credit, and to all our federal team, everyone sort of, from a federal sense, relatively speaking, went quiet because the state campaign kicked underway in January. And even if they'd wanted to, there was no oxygen available because of the state campaign and the prominence of state politics. So it wasn't sort of a hiatus, but Louise kept chipping away, involving herself in state campaign activities as best she could. And then it was, I know this always happens, but it was a triple sprint at the end. Like those last 8 weeks, 9 weeks after the state election, you had to pack 5 months of work into it because you lost, basically, hadn't really been able to cut through since December. But yeah, no miracle, strategic genius, just sheer graft, hard work.
It is hard work. How much did you factor in, or did you notice volunteer fatigue coming off the back of the state election campaign? I remember standing at the Adelaide Oval post-party and just talking to a lot of volunteers at the end of the state election, and people were knackered. Like they really put everything into it, and I was just sort of thinking, "Geez, how are you going to get up for Boothby in 8 weeks' time?"
Yeah, there was definitely a level of fatigue, and coupled with that, many good volunteers, many good staffers moved on to state government who had been, on that ride for 4 years. They're trying to set up a state government in, working harder than ever. You can't then ask them to do the simple stuff like, can you go letterboxing? Can you go door knocking? They've probably got a legitimate reason to say, no thanks, because I'm trying to, set up a government. So there was definitely a level of fatigue. That probably impacted, and we deliberately so impacted much more every other seat than Boothby. We were able to sort of ring fence, quarantine Boothby, and that's more credit to the Boothby campaign and the Boothby FEC, so the Boothby ALP members, where the diesel engine was purring from a volunteering point of view, and we just didn't. There was no point. There wasn't changing gears. Everyone just kept the diesel engine revving high and made it through another 8 weeks. But that did have an impact on, to be perfectly honest, on Sturt, where we got very close, but we just didn't have the level of volunteers because everyone was legitimately stretched elsewhere.
Looking at the, just flipping over to the Sturt results, the most recent count, Labor on a two-party preferred is at 49.3%, a couple of thousand votes just behind the Liberal incumbent James Stephens. When did you have any sense that Sturt was going to be as close as it was during the campaign?
Only probably 3 weeks out. There was a public opinion poll that had come out, or 2 of them had come out in around that time. And it was probably only then where we were comfortable that all resources that we reasonably had available to us were deployed in Boothby, and we were doing all we could reasonably do in Boothby. And then we could start to deploy excess resources, and they weren't really there weren't too many you could deploy on the ground. It was more, we could, buy some more digital, purchase another mail out, do a few more ads, those type of purchase resource allocation decisions, as opposed to staffing sort of volunteer arrangements. It was only, sort of those sort of 3 weeks out that we were sort of not confident in Boothby, but confident that we were doing all we reasonably could in Boothby, and allowed us to turn our mind to Sturt. But that's probably when and probably in hindsight, I should have been more aware of how stretched. That's when I came to a realization of, oh gosh, we are stretched and fatigued here, and we just didn't have the staff, volunteer resources to deploy because, as I said previously, many of them were busy forming a state government or already deployed in Boothby.
Any other sort of positives that you want to reflect on that came out of the federal campaign in South Australia? I was interested to note that, Amanda Rishworth, for example, in Kingston, who, when she first won that seat, that was a knife fight for her. I remember her working really hard to get elected in there, and now she almost won on primaries. That's a great result for Amanda down in Kingston.
Yeah, back in 2007, she won it back for us, and through, again, hard graft, and Amanda being Amanda, has now shifted into one of the safest seats in the country, and with no real significant boundary changes either. It is basically predominantly on the same boundaries that it was in 2007. Amanda is the exemplar when it comes down to an MP who can walk and chew gum. They can do, the important stuff at a policy level, being a shadow minister and now a minister, but also turn up at the local surf lifesaving club and, on the Saturday morning and win votes day in, day out that way. So, yeah, Amanda took care of herself. There was a transition seat where we potentially, so in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the seat of Spence, Nick Champion was stepping down and we had Matt Burnell stepping in. And Matt was left to his own devices through no real fault of his own other than Boothby gets all the priority. And there were sort of, to be crude or very generalistic, there was sort of an avenue for One Nation UAP out there around sort of anti-vax, and equally that problem that we have around the disaffected, so to speak, working class heartland that have been slowly withering away from us. So that was always one that we had to keep watching the back of our mind because Liberals were running completely dead in Spence. I think they pre-selected their candidate after we had pre-selected our candidate in Barker, which is sort of Barker's at the other end of the spectrum for us. And I think they put up, 4 corflutes or 4 posters on the polls, and yeah, they were running completely dead. So there was sort of a slight concern as where's the Liberal primary slip and where does One Nation or UAP end up. So yeah, to not have to really worry about them in the end meant that Boothby again was able to sort of absorb all the focus. But that goes to credit of people, like Amanda, like Mark Butler, Steve Drajanis, the whole gang, who just got on with it, knew Boothby was the main game, and equally Sonia Barham in Sturt. Never once did she complain about, hey, can I have one more volunteer? She did her role as a team player to the nth degree.
Looking at the results, actually, in the seat of Spence, you're right. The Liberal candidate, look at his headshot, looks like a child with a really bad sort of porno mustache. But looking at the first preferences, the primary vote for the candidates was a swing of 7% against Matt, the Labor candidate, but we saw a 4.4% swing to the Greens and a 10.9%, so almost 11% swing to One Nation. A candidate by the name of Linda Champion. I'm actually just wondering whether or not there was maybe some level of confusion as well, given that the previous member was a champion, both in name and in personality. What's your read on what's happening in the outer suburbs of Adelaide amongst the sort of the traditional Labor heartland, and Spence takes in, the suburbs of Elizabeth and Salisbury and whatnot? What's your takeaway? I know it's early, but I want to get a sense of what's your thoughts about, is this a standalone result or is it something we need to keep an eye on?
No, it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on because I think it is the general sort of problem that we have to identify is, Spence is the classic working class blue collar base. It's for those out of town. It's where Holden grew up. Like it is the Elizabeth plant of General Motors. Holden is in the middle of Spence. It is dripping blue collar, working class Australia, suburban Australia, that obviously, especially with manufacturing declining, has confronted, 15, if not 30 years of, trauma to their communities that is hard to comprehend unless you know that, there was generations of families who had worked at Holden's, and you used to walk down the shops out of Elizabeth, and every 4th person in that shop, in the shopping mall, would be in a Holden uniform picking up groceries on the way after work. And, the people in the deli were employed because, Holden's was down the road and so forth. So the trauma, not Holden's is just one example of the manufacturing that was taking place out there over the last 30 years that's slowly dripped away. So we definitely do have, that collective problem that is an example in really large numbers in Spence. But equally, in a seat like Metro Adelaide, because Adelaide's relatively small in sense of the overall city, the seat of Adelaide it sort of takes in what you'd call an inner city, but equally the working class northern belt. So there is a pincer movement happening where in the southern half of this federal Adelaide seat, we're getting eaten out by the Greens with a primary potentially in some booths approaching 25%. Even slightly higher. And then slowly in our working class heartland of federal Adelaide in the north, losing drip by drip voters at every election. And that's not a criticism so much of the MP. That's just a sort of the general trend. And Adelaide is an example of that at both ends. And Spence is probably the most obvious example in the sort of working class end if you have the answer, Stephen, or anyone on the podcast, please pick up the phone because I'm sure we're all ears.
I mean, I did know that I did want to ask you about some of the challenges, and Adelaide was one that I wanted to kind of draw your attention on. So I'm glad you lifted that up. Sort of seeing that swing to the greens on a primary. Are we talking like parts of Mile End and Thebarton that we're seeing them make gains? I think their swing to them on their primary vote in the seat of Adelaide was 4.4%, but we also saw a 3% swing to One Nation in the seat of Adelaide as well. Around that, I'm assuming around Kilburn and the Northern Party electorate. I mean, yeah, the answer, I don't know. Like, I mean, we've sort of been doing a whole bunch of these episodes with folks across the country, colleagues of yours and mine. One of my theories is that we saw swings to, certainly in Victoria and in New South Wales, we've seen swings to Labor on our primary vote where they were a marginal targeted seat. So they got the central resources from the national or the state campaign. And also they most likely had a direct voter contact program. So there were physically Labor volunteers knocking on the doors of targeted, undecided or persuadable voters and having a meaningful values-based conversation with them. Historically, when you're at a safe Labor seat, you don't do that. You're relying on, I guess, the aerial campaign of the national campaign, and maybe you do the odd mail out or whatever, but that's kind of just been the general rule of thumb about the way you campaign. My initial takeaway from all this experience is that those seats can't do that anymore. That they're going to have to actually use the resources that they've got. They're probably not going to get money. And looking at you as the party secretary in South Australia, you could probably answer this question, but I don't know if you have the resources to then allocate to make sure that we win Boothby. And I'm going to ask you in a moment about what the future looks like going into the 2025 campaign, but you've got to allocate resources where you need to hold them. Perhaps the answer is that you have to say to the Steve Janises of this world that you're going to have to build your own campaign infrastructure and run it as a marginal seat campaign, but based on your own resources that you'll have to build up over 3 years' time, and also not put people out on the doors 4 weeks out from the campaign, but start that process of volunteer organisation and mobilisation 3 years out. I want to get your thoughts on that.
No, Stephen, I think you're spot on. And the example of Federal Adelaide has always been a bit tricky because the seat got cut up drastically in a redistribution, which meant Steve Georgianis, who's been a long-term federal MP in what used to be sort of the western suburbs, the seat of Adelaide and Highmarsh got merged. So Steve has a good base. He lost his best base, so kept half of his good base, and then only had a limited time to sort of build up his base in those new areas that hadn't legitimately seen him as an MP, despite him being in Parliament and working hard for many years. So I think Steve now has the time and the office to do that. And you are right, it's got to start now. It means using your office resources appropriately and smartly to be out and about. And this is not directed at Steve or his office. This is just in general, we have to move away from that transactional, the phone rings in the electoral office and we'll solve your problem, to, using the resources of an office, because MPs are definitely out there, but it's using the resources of an office to garner volunteers, assisted with party office, to be out and about. And I think, if a little bit of opinion here or off script, I'm relatively new to the role. The only good thing about having back-to-back elections is it does now mean there isn't an election around the corner for us in South Australia. Obviously different in other states, but we have a bit of breathing space to do the second order priorities. We're here to win elections, and invariably that is the first, second and third priority. And, the next things that should be up the order but always fall off the to-do list are, growing volunteers. And I know Stephen and the Victorian branch, you've always ensured over the last decade that hasn't slipped, or has always been front and centre, because good volunteers win your elections. So I think over the next 2 years in SA, without an election bearing down us, we probably have the time and now the resources to try and replicate in some shape or form what Victoria now has done regularly for 4 or 5 state and federal elections.
Yeah, you're in a weird spot because your next poll is a federal poll again, most likely. It will be happening because you've got fixed terms over there. So you do have some breathing space to start to actually build some of that infrastructure, which will be exciting to see. Final thoughts or key learnings from the campaign before we wrap up?
My head is still a bit fuzzy from it all, so I'm maybe a little bit too simple in the sense of my key learning is what I probably know to be true is hard work pays off. I was probably a little bit pessimistic over the last few years around Boothby. So it does show that hard work does pay off, and we've been doing it for 15 years. So if there's anyone else out there that have been chipping away, continue chipping away, because sometimes it does, with a slight demographic shift, with the slight change in mood, and all those pieces that are sometimes a little bit out of your control, when they line up and you've done the hard work and you've got the foundation, then you're 90% of the way there. My only sort of, I suppose, closing remarks would be, we're very lucky in South Australia in the sense that we are a small state, so we don't have a wide field. I'm confident that we'll be a good government. I'm confident that Louise Miller-Frost will be an excellent MP. That's not to say we'll ignore Boothby, but it means I think Boothby will have resources that it needs. But all things being equal, the kitchen sink's coming towards Sturt next time, and that's the next one that we have to chip away at, and that's what we'll get started on. We've got a state by-election happening now, so it will give us 4 or 5 weeks of get through that, and then we'll turn our mind to winning Sturt, defending Boothby, and re-electing an Albo government in 3 years' time.
And then a Malinauskas one as well. Well, it's been a great story to come out of South Australia. Obviously jagging Booth, but also now having the majority of the federal seats in that South Australia sent to the federal parliament is an incredible result. And off the back of the great result that you had in March with the South Australian state election. So, as I've said to you guys before, and I've always talked up the work of the South Australian Labor campaign to you and to the whole team over there. Well done. Great job. And we wish you the best of luck in the coming years.
Cheers, Stephen. All good.
We are now moving to the Apple Isle, and joining me on the line from British Columbia, Vancouver, a place that I've never been, but I've always wanted to go, to do some election analysis on the Tasmanian results, is the Managing Director for Defiance, which is a digital firm that helps Progressive and Labor parties to raise money and build power. Jack Milroy, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen. It's good to be back as living under a majority Labor government.
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. It's sometimes it still hasn't sunk in when I'm listening to the news, and on the ABC they might refer to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. It's still taking a bit of time but a lovely thing to get used to. Now, the last time we spoke was on election night, and we said cheerio to you. I think you stuck with us for most of the night, which was a fantastic effort, giving us the results from the booths and the seats in Tasmania. And I do recall at the end, because I think by the stage we'd said cheerio to you, we had the results from WA coming in, and it looked like we were going to form a government. But, it wasn't a great night for the Taswegians. And I did say to you that we'll look forward to you coming back on the show to just dissect some of the results of election night in Tasmania. Before we do that, how was it for folks in Tassie on election night? It's sort of mixed emotions. I've been on campaigns where I've been on a winning campaign that's won against a Liberal incumbent, but we've lost the election, which is always a weird night because you're happy for your candidate, but then overall it's not been a great result for Labor. But you had the opposite. You had a whole bunch of races that we wanted to pick up that we didn't, yet we won on election night. So how was the mood in Tassie on election night?
Yeah, probably as you'd expect. It was people were pretty disappointed, I think. Obviously, as the night went on and it became clear that we were going to win the election, then people were excited about that. But the Tassie results coming in first and kind of trending pretty poorly for us from the beginning kind of coloured the mood, I guess, for the rest of the night. And people had worked hard on those campaigns too, volunteered or worked on them or were candidates or whatever. And so I think it's always hard when you work so hard on something and you see the results didn't go our way. And then that's kind of mixed or tempered with the elation of actually electing a Labor government, which is what we realised would happen later in the night. So definitely mixed, but disappointment at what, and maybe a little bit shocked. I think might be the emotion that a lot of people felt of what we saw in Tasmania.
Well, let's give the folks listening a bit of an overview of the results in Tasmania, starting with the statewide two-party preferred. Labor has a two-party preferred of 50, is that right? 53.8, whereas the coalition is a two-party preferred of 46.2. Is that right? That just doesn't...
I think that is messed up by the Wilkie and Lambie. I think it's that measure is not particularly useful, I don't think. I think the primary is probably the better way to look at it.
I just looked at that. I must admit, I cut and pasted these out of the ABC website, dropped it into a run sheet, and now I'm reading out aloud going, that can't be right. Anyway, yes, good point. Thanks. That's why I've got you on the show, Jack, to stop me from saying stupid things. Okay, yes, you're right. Let's look at the primary vote. So the coalition's primary actually was a 1.7% swing against them and took their primary down to 32.9, so just a tick under 33%. Labor's primary, however, had a 6.3% swing against it and took its primary down to 27.3. The Greens had a 1.9% swing to it, so it took up to exactly $12. One Nation had a 1.2% swing to it, up to 4%. United Palmer had a 3% swing against it, took it to 1.8, and then the others, there was a 7.9% swing to the others, which brought it up to 22%, which is a huge amount, and we'll unpack those others now. Overall reflections, seats won and changed. No seats changed. It was 2 to the coalition, 2 to Labor, and 1 to other, which is Andrew Wilkie in the seat of Clark, which is basically urban Hobart. Overall reflections of the night, looking at that primary.
Yeah, look, the primary is way too low. It remained like 6.5% swing against us on primaries is worrying. We're not going to be able to pick up the target seats we need to pick up with that measure. And, Andrew Wilkie's not going to be around forever, right? At some point he will retire, and we need to win back the seat of Clark as well. So, the primary is too low. It's largely consistent, sadly, with what we got at the state election last year, where we also saw a primary around that number. We did a little better in the federal in some electorates, and we did a little worse in others, but generally it's around the same. So it's pointing to a picture of, Labor kind of stuck at around that, 27 to 30% primary vote.
It's just an interesting result, and we'll start to sort of work out where Labor lost votes on their primary, and that other. I mean, the other is obviously made up of both Andrew Wilkie, but also Jackie Lambie's party ran candidates across the state in all 5 electorates. Is that right, Jack? Or
look, they ran them in all our target seats. The only question maybe, did they run someone in Clark? I think they did. I'm pretty sure they ran in all 5, and they also ran hard in the Senate as well. Jackie wasn't up, but they elected another senator in Tammy Tyrrell in the Senate. So it was a statewide push for sure. And the others vote gets a bit skewed because Wilkie does so well on a primary in Clark, but Lambie does very well around the state.
Okay, the way that we've been doing these podcasts to this point has been looking at some pluses, some deltas, and some key learnings. And so let's do the pluses first of all. Probably not a great deal of positives to come out of the campaign, but certainly the Lions win was a great win, because on election night we weren't sure about how it was going to go. It's a huge electorate in itself. It's just the boundaries of it sort of are just south of Launceston and Devonport, and go all the way down to just the northern fringes of Hobart, and taking most of the east coast of the island. So it's a huge chunk of land to sort of cover. Western Australians who are organising in Kalgoorlie right now are laughing at me about this. For Tasmania, it's a big plot of land. There was a 4% swing to the Libs on the 2PP. We saw a 7.4% swing against Labor on its primary, the candidate incumbent Brian Mitchell, but still managed to hang on. What are the positives that we can take from the result in Lions?
Yeah, look, the Lions result was great to keep that seat. And I think one of the things that people should remember is that in the 2019 election, the Liberals essentially ran dead because their candidate, I forget the name, but their candidate essentially dropped out after having some revelations of some things that they'd said, and I don't remember exactly what they were. But so essentially the Liberals didn't really run a real campaign in 2019. So when you're seeing a 13% swing to the Liberals this time, that's not totally reflective of like what a 13% swing might normally mean. This is a lot of Liberal voters now actually have somewhere to put their vote and didn't last time. So I guess what I'm saying is like that the swing against us in Lions is the result in 2019 was probably a bit inflated because of the Liberals' problems, so we should have expected this to be close. Lambie's candidate still pulled 11% of the primary vote, which is pretty revealing, I think. And I also think that electorate is there's not many Labor electorates anymore in the country that are predominantly rural and semi-rural, small towns, farming communities. The fact that Labor was able to hold that seat, I think, in a time where our coalition is shifting to be less reflective of those areas, I think speaks well of the campaign there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, I mean, it's knife edge. I think I know the count hasn't completely finished, but it's going to wind up around 50.8% to PP for Labor, so less than 1% that Brian will have to defend the seat in 2025. And as you said as well, a 10.9% swing to the Lambie Network candidate. It's the first time they're standing, so it's not actually a swing. It's actually they just picked up 10% of the vote, or 11% of the vote. Is a worry. But yes, great point that you make. The fact that it is a rural seat and we managed to hang on to it is an incredible achievement for Brian and for the Labor team down in Tassie.
Yeah, totally. It was. It didn't look good early in the night, but it looked a lot better over the next couple of days. So I'm thankful for that.
Okay, let's. Is there any other pluses you want to take from the night before we move into some of the deltas?
Look, I'll just say that the campaign team, obviously worked really hard. I think that the volunteers worked really hard in the final weeks, and it's tough sometimes. Sometimes there are kind of political forces that are hard to push against, and that feels a little bit like where we were. So look, I would just say, always want to give a shout out to all the campaigners, the organisers, the state secretary, campaign director, and everyone who did that work. Obviously, there's going to need to be some learnings, but I saw a lot of volunteers, out there working hard, and that's always a plus.
I mean, I don't know if you got any data on this, but did you think that there were more volunteers in this campaign than say in previous cycles? I mean, are we seeing a shift in the volunteer capacity in the Tasmanian Party to growing that capacity over cycles?
Yeah, look, I couldn't say because this is my first federal election living in Tassie. But what I'll say, so I was a vendor. I worked with the party on the campaign, doing some digital stuff, predominantly fundraising for them, and also did some online volunteer recruitment through our lists as well to help the organising team. And what I would say is that when you've got a state like Tasmania where you've got essentially two big population centres and then a lot of kind of rural and semi-rural areas that still need campaigners and door knockers, that is tough because it's not that hard to get volunteers in Hobart. Clark's not a target seat. Obviously Launceston is in the target seat of Bass, and people up there can be put to use, but a lot of people live in Hobart. So what I would say is it's often about distribution and where people are. So I think the challenge going forward is going to be how do we mobilize the volunteers that we have where they are, and not ask them to do things that are, can you drive out to so-and-so, to Sorel to do door knocking? A lot of people just don't want to do that, and that's fair enough. So we need to find ways to plug those people in, either from home or in their local neighbourhood, and allow them to take action there. And I think that's how we grow our volunteer capacity over time. But, it is a challenge when you've got the population kind of distribution that we have in Tasmania.
It sounds like a distributed snowflake leadership model might come in handy for the Tasmanian branch going forward.
Absolutely does. It absolutely expensive, but I think necessary.
Well, I'm sure we can work something out. Okay, let's talk about some of the deltas from the campaign. Starting with Bass, at the LP primary was at 28.6%, which is just too low and asking way too much to get the count to 50.1%. Tell us a bit about Bass and some of the challenges that we had in that particular race.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Bass was tough and was always going to be tough when I guess at the point that Bridget Archer made the Liberal incumbent MP made the decision to kind of pretty decisively break with Scott Morrison on a few key issues. My intuition is that if she hadn't done that, we would, Ross Hart would have won that seat back. But, I guess credit to her, political mind, knowing that was the way to distinguish herself from a pretty toxic Liberal brand. So that's one thing. I think that they had a good candidate who made some smart decisions. The 28% or 29% primary, is obviously too low. Some context too is that in Bass, the Lambie network was preferencing the Liberals in Bass. They preferenced us in Braddon, I believe, and Lions, I think. But Bass obviously is the one we really wanted it the most. So that didn't go. That didn't help. You're certainly not going to get from 29% to 50%, without the Lambie network probably. So we did well to come close. It's clearly a competitive area. It's clearly somewhere we are going to need to throw a lot of resources and time into over the next few years, as we go up to the next state election as well. But yeah, that primary is just too low. And Bridget Archer is a good campaigner and clearly is liked in the community.
I'm interested to actually get a sense. I never really bothered to sort of read into why the Lambie network were hedging their bets across the seats. Why did they send their preferences to the Liberal Party in Bass as opposed to what they did in Braddon?
I don't know exactly why they made the decision to preference Labor in some and Liberals in others. I believe, and I wasn't involved in the negotiations, but I believe it was tied up with the Senate seat and negotiations around preferences for the Senate. I believe there was a whole complicated thing around that, and our negotiators were able to get preferences in most of the seats, but for some reason, whether it was preserve relationships with the Liberal Party, or I'm not sure if Jackie and Bridget have a relationship, they decided in Bass to go the other way, and I guess they kind of sold that as we oppose Morrison, and so generally we're preferencing Labor, although in the most marginal seat they didn't. So you can kind of ask yourself how much that is worth. But it's not something that received a lot of media coverage in Tasmania during the campaign.
If we can turn to the seat of Braddon, which was another difficult count for us on election night, we had swings against Labor of almost 10% on its primary, 6% swings to the Libs, and the Lambie candidate and an independent grabbing a combined primary vote of 18%. And one thing I did notice that there were swings of up to 12% against the Labor Party in urban booths in Davenport and in Burnie. Which is where I would, and most of that seemed to have been going to the Lambie Party or the Independent. I'm assuming that these are our people. Well, historically, these have been our people, and if we're going to win Braddon, we need to make sure these people vote for us in a primary. What's going on there in Braddon?
Yeah, hugely worrying if we're seeing swings like that away from us in Burnie and Davenport. We're not going to make that up in the more rural areas. That's just not going to happen. Braddon, I think we thought Braddon would be closer than this. I think we always knew Braddon would be harder to win than Bass, and we'd come closer, or it'd be easier in Bass, but I think that the scale of the swing maybe is a little surprising. I think demographically, you've got to take a step back and look at the overall demographics of places like Braddon, and where does the Labor Party nationally do well, and it is not in places like Braddon anymore. A lot of the kind of what the Americans might call the white working class is moving away from Labor and parking their votes with Lambie or One Nation, or even sometimes with the Liberals. And so that makes those seats quite hard. And I don't think it was anything necessarily about the campaign there. The candidate was a really good candidate, was well known and well liked, and had a long history there. So that wasn't an issue. And I know worked hard. I just think those demographics are getting really, really tough for the Labor Party. And our expectations around where we can win, we should probably take a bit of a lead from what happened on the mainland, and learn a little bit about which parts of the coalition are moving towards us and which are moving away from us, and what that might mean for where we target in Tasmania.
I've never been to the northern part of Tasmania. Talk to me about the communities that live in places like Davenport and Burnie. I mean, if they were traditionally working class Labor voters, what kind of jobs do they have, or did they have, and what's driving them away from Labor now?
Yeah, look, I'm not from up there, and I know, and there are other people who can speak to that with more authority. I'm a southerner, so I wouldn't want to speak for people in the north. But look, in those towns, cities, look, there's a kind of post-industrial kind of working class. I think that there are still a lot of resource jobs up there, or there's a legacy of resource jobs. I think people in the party in Tasmania will tell you that the minority government that Labor had at the state level with the Greens, and some of the decisions around forestry, this is well before my time, so I don't know it well, has a legacy that can sometimes maybe tarnish Labor's brand among some of those communities. I don't know how accurate it would be to say that that's still a factor now, 20 or 30 years later, but that's what people say. I think the other thing is you've also got population up there in certain parts of the northwest growing. A lot of the smaller towns along the coast, towns like Penguin, and there's a lot of places along there that people are moving either from the mainland or from Launceston or Hobart They're getting beachfront, properties. It's absolutely beautiful up there. It's a stunning part of the world. And so there is some population shifts happening up there that are changing the demographics a bit. But they're the kind of small numbers compared to the people that the populations in the bigger centres. So I think it's reflective of Labor's challenge with working class, predominantly white working class voters across the country.
If that's the case, and we're seeing a swing against us in our traditional working class base, and what we saw in the mainland was swings against us. Actually, to be fair, what we've discovered across the course of this series of podcasts is that there's swings against Labor on its primary, basically everywhere. Out of suburban, it's been swinging to sort of One Nation and Palmer, and in the inner city, it's been swinging to the Green. So I think we're having a problem with our primary vote everywhere at this particular election. And I think one of the things we did note was that we certainly in WA, in Victoria, in New South Wales, in South Australia, that we saw swings to us on our primary vote where we ran an actual marginal seat campaign that had a field program. But we saw swings against us everywhere in Tasmania. Julie Collins had a swing against her on her primary of 7%. In the seat of Clark, which basically is Hobart. And you and I were talking off air beforehand. I was down in Hobart 2 weekends ago. Everyone looks like a greenie walking around the parts of South Hobart that I was in. Swings against Labor there. So we're having swings against us both in our Labor base, but also in our sort of, I guess I'd call that sort of that post-Whitlam academic educated middle class base as well. But yet we ran target seats in Tasmania. This is the only place that bucks my theory, is that where you have a well-resourced marginal seat campaign that you are going to get swings. If you go and knock on people's doors and you have conversations, meaningful, values-based conversations with folks, they will consider voting for you, and we see swings to us on our primary. This didn't happen in Tasmania. What's going on?
Yeah, so I think there's two things there. There's the coalition, who are the voters in our coalition and how they're shifting, and then there is the campaign itself and the field campaign and the resourcing of it. So I'll kind of take each of them. So you're absolutely right. Like there's no social democratic, center left, liberal progressive, however you want to define it, political party in the Westminster world that wins without support from the working class, from the diversifying working class and middle class professionals, women, university and tertiary educated people. That doesn't happen. That's the basis of Justin Trudeau's success. It's the basis of Jacinda Ardern's success. It's the basis of Dan Andrews' success. It happens. That's the formula. In Tasmania, we are losing some of our traditional working class voters, and we have over a period of a decade. But we are not replacing them with voters from that kind of urban educated middle class bucket. And people might hear that and say, oh, well, you want to abandon the working class. And that's absolutely not what's happening. I want to win elections. And you have to be additive in politics to win. And so what I think I was struck by moving to Hobart a few years ago was that this isn't a Labor town. When everything demographically about it says it should be a Labor town. So I think that is interesting. And when it comes to the field campaign stuff, so we ran marginal seat campaigns for sure, and there was investment over the obviously the 6 weeks, but then a couple of months prior as well. But what we don't have in the Tasmanian branch is a culture of community organising or constant campaigning or kind of field. We don't have that culture, and it's not because people don't agree with it or think it would be good. We have a resourcing problem in Tasmania in that the party nationally often relies on Labor in Tasmania to get us over the line in close elections. Now, we are lucky in this election that WA provided that role that Tasmania would normally provide. So that's fantastic. But WA is at its high water mark. We are not going to win all those seats back in the next election, although we'll try hard to defend them, but it'll be a different political climate by then. And so then the focus will have to come back to Tasmania. And I guess what my kind of take on this is that if the National Party is kind of relying on us, and they are, and I understand why, we need the resources to have more than one or two people employed by the Tasmanian branch. We need field organisers. We need people to work on digital. We need the resources to run in a kind of big kind of not geographically big, but diverse and complicated state, and we need to be making those investments now and building those field programs now. And so that's what will make us competitive next time. And the branch does well fundraising, but it's a small fundraising base. It's a lower income state, and it's just smaller. The unions are smaller, the affiliates are smaller. There's less fundraising to be had. So we're absolutely maximizing the fundraising. I did the online fundraising, and the State Secretary Sturt does great work doing the other fundraising. But we also need investment, I think, from the National Party if we're going to be relied upon to kind of bring home these close elections.
Well, hopefully Paul Erickson's listened to this podcast and might heed your request. Let's talk about Hobart. I'm interested. I just want to pick up on that point you said before. It looks like a Labor town, but it's not a Labor town. And obviously, Andrew Wilkie's held the seat now for a number of years. I think he won. Did he win it in 2010? He did win it in 2010.
Whatever the minority year was, whenever that was. Yeah.
Yeah, 2010. And had held it ever since, and is holding it quite comfortably on a 2PP. I think he holds it by 70% at 2PP for his party, him as an independent. What's going on in Hobart?
Yeah, it's a really good question because like all the data points would suggest that this should be a Labor town, and then you could say, well, Wilkie's really popular. When he goes, you would assume we would revert to the fundamentals. That's what you would assume. You assume Wilkie retires, and then Labor nominates a great candidate, and we're back to being pretty to holding the seat again, or being extremely competitive, where we're not competitive at all right now. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because what you've seen, Wilkie's kind of like an early Teal, like he's like an OG Teal. In a lot of ways, right? Except he's kind of cranky and a man. He's certainly not. He certainly doesn't have like the dynamism of some of the Teal candidates that kind of slayed dragons on the mainland. But I think that there's a lot of focus in Tasmania on Braddon and Bass at the state level as well. And there's less of a focus building the infrastructure long term that you need to win in Hobart and Clark, and I think that's something that we kind of need to look at, and that something that people might find interesting about Tasmania is that we don't run Labor candidates for council. They run as independents, but who's Labor, right? Because they're in your branch, but we don't run Labor campaigns, and at least my kind of theory of politics is that you want Labor to be everywhere all the time and always showing up for people, and also building your bench and building your next generation of candidates. So I think that's something that we could look at in Hobart and the cities that make up Clark, Glenorchy and the other cities, to build our power there. I hope that we look at that. But Hobart has each of the three kind of constituencies that I think about. So that it's got working class voters in the northern suburbs. It's got small G Greens, who are sometimes capital G Greens, that are Enviro voters, and then it's got kind of middle class, urban, tertiary educated, liberal progressives, and we're kind of not assembling the coalition that we need out of those three constituencies, and I think that that's something we need to look at pretty hard in Hobart.
Looking at the comparison between the state election results in 2021 and the federal election results in 2022 at a primary vote level, one of the great things about the way that the seats are structured in Tasmania, for folks that may not know this, but the state boundaries or the state divisions in Tasmania are the same as the feds. There's Bass, Braddon, Lyons, Clark, and Franklin. The only difference is that they have a Hare-Clark system where multiple candidates can get elected out of the one state division. But if we were to compare Bass between the two results in the state election in 2021 and the federal election in 2022, there's a 2-point difference. We're 2% better in the Fed than we were in the state, but still not a lot. Like it's 26 versus 28. In Braddon, we were worse off in the Fed. It's 26 in the state, 22% primary in the Fed. In Lyons, 32% in the state primary, 29 in the Fed. Clark, 22% in the state primary, 18 in the Fed. And Franklin, which is the safest of Labor seats, 33% in the state primary, 36% in the Fed. You imagine maybe Julie Collins might have a personal vote there. Looking at those numbers, though, broadly speaking, they're very, very similar across the board. And I'm just wondering, does Labor is the brand Labor struggling in Tasmania right now? And I've got all these candidates busting their guts to try and get a result, but it's actually the colour of the ticket that's hurting them a bit.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think it'd be disingenuous to say no. It's been a rough couple of years for the Labor Party in Tasmania. From the state election, the early state election onwards, it's been a tough time. Our brand, I think we were rebuilding our brand at a state level, and Leader Rebecca White was doing extremely well in the polls before COVID hit. And then, of course, we suffered from what every opposition suffered during COVID. And then there's bad blood in the branch too. There's conflicts, there's tensions, personality things. There's stuff that has spilled out into the public that I don't think voters particularly love. But I will say that where we have incumbents in those state seats, they tend to do quite well. We have incumbents around the state. And so once people elect Labor members, they tend to stick around and they tend to keep their seats. So I think there's something in that. And I am hopeful that now that we've kind of cleared these 2 election cycles, which were within a year, and we have 3 years until our next election, although we have 2 elections in that year, which will be wild. Hopeful that this kind of rebuilding process and some of the brand, resetting the brand can happen. But that'll kind of need to be done kind of intentionally. So, it'd be crazy to say we didn't have challenges, but plenty of branches have turned around those challenges. New South Wales has turned that around in the last year, I would say, under Minns' leadership. And it's obviously happened in other places too. So definitely some brand issues, but, I'm hopeful that we've got the space now to kind of work on those.
Let's get to the sort of the wrap-up part of the podcast, which is we talk about the key learnings or key takeaways. Where do you see where the party in Tasmania can start to make some inroads, some improvements, and what are some of the lessons that you would take from this result?
Yeah, look, I actually think there's kind of three. I think there's 3 things we can do as a party and as a branch in the next couple of years to get us in a winning position for the next state election, or and the federal election. So. The first one is the resourcing one I mentioned earlier. We've got to get more resources into the branch through various different means and methods. And, we'll continue fundraising, we'll online fundraise, we'll do other fundraising. But we also, I think, need outside investment in the party from outside. And if we do that, we can build our internal capacity as a party to be campaigning constantly and to be doing the type of stuff you need to do to be kind of really match fit for a campaign. At the moment, with the current resourcing that we have, the staff and the state secretary are working extremely hard just to keep the kind of show running, just to keep it moving and do the governance and stuff like that. So we need resources. So the second thing would be, I think we need, and a lot of branches need this. This isn't just a Tasmanian thing. When I click around the internet, we need a full digital rebuild. We are not set up for communicating and engaging with people online in a way that is expected in 2022. We've got a technology stack that's outdated. Our web presence, our social media presence is not where it needs to be, and that's the case for a number of branches. It's not just us here. So that's the second thing I would say. And then the third thing, and you'll love this one, is I think we need to adopt a community organizing approach, like the CAN approach that you've worked on and piloted. I think we need to adopt that in Tasmania. I think Tasmania is well suited to it. I think we have a really engaged membership that would be happy to take up community organizing and would love to be trained in it. And I think it can make a real difference in how we get back in touch with those working class voters that we're losing, but also how we start to talk to these other parts of the coalition, the kind of the middle class, tertiary educated progressives, and how what you do then through community organizing, as you know, it's not just about getting people to vote for you. It's about understanding what the commonalities are between those different parts of the coalition. So then when you put together your political message, you're not pitting one against the other or having to choose. You're able to find unifying threads and themes because you've had all those conversations and you've had all those house parties and you've had all those events. So that's the third thing I would say that would be really, really beneficial for us to do over the next few years.
Well, as you said, in WA as well, there's a good break now between, and in South Australia too, actually, there's a good break now between the next set of elections, although I guess you've got a couple of smaller kind of ballots coming up. But in terms of the big ones, both the state election and the next federal election won't be until 2025. When's the next state election? 2025, isn't it, roughly?
2025, yeah. I mean, unless they do something crazy and go early again, but hopefully not.
So, yeah, I mean, you've got some time to unpack what happened on May 21 and take some learnings from that and then build from that to hopefully see a good result for both Tasmanian Labor at a state level, but also at the next federal election. Jack, Milroy, thank you very much for coming back on the show. It's been great to see you. I know you've got to catch a flight back to Australia pretty soon, so we do appreciate you coming on the show. Looks like beautiful weather in Vancouver. I'm living vicariously through that window. I know that this is only an audio meeting, but I'll let me assure you, everyone listening to this podcast, that is a lovely view that Jack has found himself in. It's very, very impressive. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to be here again.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.